March 18, 1943. Wewak, New Guinea. 47 Japanese aircraft sat in neat rows on 4 pristine airfields carved from jungle. At 07:23 hours, radar operators detected incoming aircraft. They counted 12. 12 Allied planes against fortified positions defended by 89 anti-aircraft guns and 2,400 ground personnel. The Japanese air commander smiled. This would be a slaughter. He was wrong. Dead wrong. By 07:41 hours, 18 minutes later, 40 of those 47 Japanese aircraft were burning wrecks. The remaining 7 were damaged beyond repair. Total Japanese casualties: 137 dead, over 200 wounded. Allied losses: 0 aircraft, 0 casualties. And the American 5th Air Force intelligence officer who reviewed the after-action footage drew a red line through his initial assessment and wrote one word: impossible. What happened at Wewak that morning was classified at the highest levels for 14 months. The tactical innovation was so dangerous, so contrary to every principle of aerial warfare, that American Bomber Command initially refused to believe the reports. When they finally saw the gun camera footage, they banned the technique outright for U.S. pilots. Too risky, too reckless, too likely to result in catastrophic losses. But Royal Australian Air Force pilots kept doing it anyway. They flew lower, they flew faster, and they destroyed Japanese air power in the Southwest Pacific using a method that shouldn't have worked, that violated every doctrine in the manual, and that killed more enemy aircraft on the ground in 6 months than conventional bombing had destroyed in 2 years. By the end of this video, you will understand why Japanese air commanders stopped calling RAAF pilots suicidal. They called them something else: Akuma, demons. Stay with me. New Guinea in 1943 was hell with humidity. The island stretched 1,500 miles along the equator, covered in triple canopy jungle so thick that downed pilots who survived the crash died of starvation within sight of rescue parties. The heat was murderous. 110 degrees Fahrenheit in shade that didn't exist. Rain fell in sheets that turned dirt airstrips into swamps within minutes. Coral dust got into everything: engines, eyes, lungs, and turned to paste with sweat. And carved into this nightmare landscape, the Japanese had built 17 operational airfields. Conventional bombing didn't work here. American B-17 and B-24s flying at 15,000 to 20,000 feet dropped thousands of tons of ordnance on these bases with minimal effect. The problem was simple physics and jungle engineering. Japanese construction crews would repair cratered runways in hours using coral fill and compacted earth. Aircraft were dispersed under jungle canopy, invisible from altitude. Revetments, walls of logs and earth, absorbed blast effects from near misses. And most damningly, circular error probable at high altitude meant only 12% of bombs fell within 1,000 feet of their aim point. The Americans were fighting a war of attrition they couldn't win. Japanese aircraft damaged in raids were replaced within days from massive supply depots at Rabaul. American bomber losses, even the low ones, couldn't be sustained. And time was the enemy. Every week the Japanese held these airfields was another week they could interdict Allied supply lines, strafe ground forces, and dominate the airspace over the Huon Peninsula. But this was only the surface. Major Thomas Lynch stood on the operations tent veranda at Port Moresby on March 16, 1943, watching Australian pilots prepare for a strike mission. Lynch was 5th Air Force, a P-38 fighter pilot with 19 confirmed kills and a distinguished flying cross. He'd flown combat over Europe and the Pacific. He knew aircraft, and he knew tactics, and what he was watching made absolutely no sense. The Australians were flying Beaufighters, big, heavy twin-engine aircraft that were supposed to be night fighters. They were loading them not with bombs, but with 4 20mm cannons in the nose and 6.303 machine guns in the wings. They were studying topographic maps at scales Lynch had never seen used for air operations. Maps showing individual trees, elevation changes measured in feet, even the height of kunai grass near target zones. "You're going in at what altitude?" Lynch asked Squadron Leader Charles Learmonth. 50 feet, Learmonth said, not looking up from his map. 50 feet is suicide. Anti-aircraft fire will tear you apart. Learmonth finally looked at him. "Can't hit what they can't track, mate. We'll be too low and too fast." Lynch did the math in his head. Beaufighters cruised at 270 knots. At 50 feet, Reaction time for ground defenses would be under 3 seconds. Suit yourself. But you're flying back seat in my aircraft. If you're going to call us reckless, you should see it firsthand. What Lynch witnessed in the next 4 hours would destroy his understanding of aerial warfare. Lynch noticed the smell first. Not fuel or oil, those were constant in any aircraft. This was something else. Salt. They were flying so low over the Bismarck Sea that spray from whitecaps was hitting the windscreen. The altimeter read 35 feet. American doctrine for ground attack operations specified minimum altitude of 500 feet for heavy aircraft, 300 feet for fighters. This was to provide margin for error, escape routes if hit, and sufficient reaction time for pilots to recover from turbulence or mechanical issues. The statistics supported this doctrine. Aircraft flying below 200 feet had a 340% higher accident rate than those above 500 feet. Learmonth was flying at 35 feet doing 290 knots. That's 487 feet per second. At this altitude, if the aircraft pitched down even 2 degrees, they'd hit water in 1.3 seconds. There was no margin, no room for error, no second chances. But there was method in the madness. Japanese radar stations couldn't track aircraft below 200 feet. The signal return merged with ocean clutter. Visual spotters couldn't see them coming because they were below the horizon line until the last 15 seconds. And anti-aircraft fire needed tracking time. Gunners had to acquire target, calculate lead, traverse guns, and fire. At this speed and altitude, by the time they completed those steps, the Australians were already past them. They hit Wewak from the northeast at 0723 hours. Lynch saw the airfield appear, suddenly, violently, filling the windscreen. Learmonth pulled up to exactly 50 feet, lined up on a row of parked Mitsubishi G4M bombers, and opened fire. The 20mm cannons made a sound Lynch would remember for the rest of his life. Not the bang of anti-aircraft fire he was used to. This was a buzzsaw roar, 4 cannons firing 600 rounds per minute each, 2,400 shells per minute total, each shell weighing 4 ounces and carrying high explosive incendiary compound. The first Betty bomber exploded, then the second, then the third. Learmonth's firewalk lasted 11 seconds and destroyed 8 aircraft before he broke left and dove back to wavetop height. Lynch checked his watch. They'd been over the target for 17 seconds, total time visible to Japanese defenses, 22 seconds from horizon to horizon. "That's layer 1, Learmonth said over the intercom. "Now watch what happens when they try to shoot back." But what Lynch witnessed next would disturb him further. Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine, like American doctrine, was based on altitude advantage. Guns were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire at standard bombing altitudes, 8,000 to 20,000 feet. Battery commanders calculated intercept courses based on aircraft speed, altitude, and heading. Tracers marked trajectories for other gunners to follow. None of this worked against aircraft at 50 feet. Learmonth made his second pass. This time, Lynch was watching the ground. Japanese AA crews were firing. He could see muzzle flashes from 75mm and 40mm positions, but the shells were detonating 400 feet above them. The gunners were compensating for altitude that didn't exist. Their training, their muscle memory, everything told them aircraft didn't fly at 50 feet. So they aimed higher. The few guns that did manage to depress to near horizontal couldn't track fast enough. The Beaufighter was doing 290 knots at 50 feet altitude. It crossed the width of the airfield, roughly 600 meters, in 7.1 seconds. The traverse speed of a Type 88 75mm AA gun was 6 degrees per second. To track the Beaufighter from acquisition to departure required 47 degrees of traverse. The math was simple. They needed 7.8 seconds to track a target that was visible for 7.1 seconds. Lynch watched 3 more Beaufighters make passes. Each flew a slightly different approach angle. None flew the same escape route. The patterns were random, unpredictable. Japanese gunners who tried to anticipate the next pass were aiming at empty sky when the aircraft appeared from a different vector. And the carnage was extraordinary. Lynch counted 17 distinct explosions during the 4-minute attack. 18 Japanese aircraft destroyed. 3 fuel bowsers hit, creating secondary fires that spread to revetments. 1 ammunition storage area cooking off, sending tracers in random directions that caused Japanese personnel to abandon AA positions. When they egressed, flying north at wave-top height, Lynch looked back. The airfield was burning. Smoke columns rose 2,000 feet, and not a single Australian aircraft had been hit. "How many times have you done this?" Lynch asked. "This specific base? Third time? Other targets?" "Lost count around 40. Lynch did math he didn't want to do. 40 low-level strikes, 0 losses. That was a loss rate of 0.0%. American Bomber Command was losing 3 to 5% per mission. The statistical improbability of the Australian survival rate was so extreme, it suggested either their intelligence was wrong about Japanese defenses, or the Australians had discovered something fundamental that invalidated conventional doctrine. "But the altitude is only the first layer," Learmonth said. "What you're about to see is what really breaks them." What Lynch learned next was buried in classified archives for 18 months, stamped secret, not for distribution to Allied commands, because American bomber generals believed if the technique became widespread, pilot losses would become catastrophic. Flight Lieutenant William Newton was 26 years old on March 16, 1943. He'd flown 32 low-level strike missions in 4 months. He'd destroyed 16 Japanese aircraft on the ground and damaged another 23. His Beaufighter, tail number A-19-144, had taken ground fire twice but never suffered critical damage. He was, by all metrics, the most successful anti-aircraft pilot in the Southwest Pacific Theater. He was also violating orders. RAAF Command had established 50 feet as the minimum altitude for strike runs. Newton routinely flew at 35 feet, sometimes 30. He'd been reprimanded twice. He didn't stop. His reasoning, recorded in his personal log and declassified in 1975, was simple. Every 5 feet lower gives the enemy 1/10 of a second less reaction time. At 30 feet, they cannot hit me. At 50 feet, they might. I choose 30. On March 18th, during the second Wewak raid, Newton made 4 passes. The first 3 were textbook, straight-line runs at 30 feet, guns firing for 10 to 12 seconds, multiple aircraft destroyed per pass, egress at wave-top height. But on his 4th pass, he spotted something that changed his approach. A Mitsubishi Ki 46 reconnaissance aircraft, call sign Dinah by Allied intelligence, was being fueled in a revetment on the north side of the field. These aircraft were rare, valuable, and carried sophisticated camera equipment that made them priority targets. But the revetment was positioned between 2 AA battery positions, with a 3rd battery on higher ground 200 meters west. Flying the standard approach would expose Newton to overlapping fire from all 3 batteries. He flew it anyway. Newton's approach was from the southeast at 30 feet, engines screaming at maximum continuous power. 303 knots indicated airspeed. He fired from 800 meters out, walking his cannon fire into the revetment. The Ki 46 exploded. The fuel bowser next to it exploded. The explosion created a fireball that rose 300 feet and detonated ammunition stores in the revetment's protective walls. And Newton flew through the fireball. Lynch was in Learmonth's aircraft 1,500 meters east when it happened. He saw Newton's Beaufighter enter the smoke and flame. He saw it emerge on the other side, still flying, trailing smoke from the port engine, pieces of burning fabric falling from the wing. Newton didn't break off. He turned north, dove to 20 feet over the jungle, and egressed with the rest of the formation. His port engine failed 12 miles north of Wewak. He ditched in the ocean. He and his navigator survived the crash, deployed their life raft, and were picked up 3 hours later by a Catalina rescue aircraft. When Lynch asked him why he'd flown through the explosion instead of breaking off, Newton's answer was recorded in 5th Air Force Intelligence Summary 43-118. "If I'd pulled up, the AA batteries would have had time to track me. At 30 feet through the fire, they couldn't see me. Simple choice. Simple choice between certain anti-aircraft fire and possible immolation, and he chose the fire." Lynch realized something that day that he would later testify to in front of a joint Allied command review board. These Australians weren't reckless. They'd simply done the math differently. They'd calculated that flying lower was statistically safer than flying higher, even though it felt more dangerous. Even though every instinct screamed that it was suicidal, the numbers supported them. Between January and June 1943, RAAF, Beaufighter squadrons flew 614 low-level strike missions against Japanese targets in New Guinea. They destroyed 427 aircraft on the ground, damaged another 189, destroyed 67 fuel and ammunition storage facilities, and killed an estimated 2,100 Japanese ground personnel. Total RAF losses during this period: 11 aircraft, 15 aircrew killed, 7 captured. That's a 1.79% loss rate. For comparison, American B-17 missions over Europe during the same period had loss rates ranging from 4% to 9%. 8th Air Force would lose 4,754 bombers over Europe before war's end. The Australians flying at 50 feet in New Guinea were statistically safer than American crews flying at 20,000 feet over Germany. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because the most disturbing element of the Australian low-level doctrine wasn't the altitude or the math, or even the courage. It was what it did to the enemy. The Japanese perspective reveals something that no Allied after-action report captured: the psychological destruction that came from being attacked by aircraft you couldn't defend against. From the personal diary of Captain Nakamura Shinobu, Air Defense Commander, Wewak Airfield Complex. Recovered from Japanese archives, Canberra, 1952. Translation by Dr. Hiroshi Takahashi. Second raid in 2 days. 41 aircraft destroyed. This is not sustainable. Defense batteries fired 1,847 rounds of 75mm and 40mm ammunition. Confirmed hits: 0. The enemy aircraft appear without warning, too low for radar detection. Visual spotters provide 4 to 6 seconds advance warning, insufficient time for battery crews to depress guns to engagement angle. By the time traversing is complete, enemy aircraft have departed. This is not warfare. This is execution. Battery commanders report crews are afraid to remain at positions. They hear the enemy engines, that distinctive twin radial roar, and they know the aircraft will appear at treetop height, moving too fast to track. Some crews have abandoned positions before enemy aircraft arrive. I have restored discipline with summary punishment, but morale is broken. The enemy flies at heights our weapons cannot reach, not too high, too low. We designed defenses against aircraft at 5,000 to 20,000 feet. These aircraft operate at 10 to 15 meters. Our doctrine has no answer for this. Third raid: 34 aircraft destroyed. Weather was perfect for defense. Clear visibility, no rain, full daylight. Made no difference. The enemy uses terrain features to mask approach. They fly below the level of the coconut palms along the coast. Spotters on the shore cannot see them until they are already over the airfield. I have requested additional automatic weapons, type 98 20mm guns that can be aimed by hand without traversing mechanisms. Command has denied the request. They say 20mm rounds cannot damage enemy heavy aircraft. They are correct in principle, but principle is meaningless when 75mm guns cannot acquire target. I have requested additional automatic weapons, type 98 20mm guns that can be aimed by hand without traversing mechanisms. Command has denied the request. They say 20mm rounds cannot damage enemy heavy aircraft. They are correct in principle, but principle is meaningless when 75mm guns cannot acquire target. I would rather fire 20mm rounds at aircraft I can see than 75mm shells at empty sky. Crews are calling the enemy aircraft Akuma, demons. They say the Australians have made a pact with death gods that allow them to fly where men cannot. This is superstition born from fear, but I cannot suppress it because I half believe it myself. Fifth raid. I have stopped counting destroyed aircraft. The numbers are meaningless. We replace them. They are destroyed within days. The pattern is predictable now. Enemy appears from random direction, flying lower than our gun depression limits, destroys parked aircraft with cannon fire, departs before effective response is possible. I have proposed a new defense doctrine. Disperse aircraft in small groups throughout surrounding jungle, never more than 3 aircraft per location, with camouflage netting and revetments positioned under overhead canopy. This will make each aircraft harder to destroy, but will also complicate our own operations. Command has approved this measure. They have no other options. The enemy has taught us that altitude advantage means nothing if the enemy refuses to fight at altitude. They have broken the rules of aerial warfare, and in doing so have made our defenses obsolete. This is what defeat looks like, not from superior firepower or numbers, but from opponent who approaches the battlefield from an angle you did not design defenses for. Cannot continue in current role. Have requested transfer to fighter squadron. Preference is death in cockpit over watching helpless as enemy destroys everything we build. Request denied. Command requires experienced air defense officers. I will remain. Yesterday's raid destroyed 16 aircraft in 11 seconds. Gun cameras from our defensive positions show enemy aircraft flying at estimated 8 to 12 meters altitude. This is below the height of a 4-story building. They are flying through space where aircraft should not be able to fly, at speeds that should be impossible to control at such altitude. The crews no longer call them Akuma. The word has changed. Shinigami, death spirits, creatures that exist between worlds, that can move through spaces forbidden to the living. I am educated man, university trained in mathematics and engineering. I do not believe in spirits, but I have watched these aircraft fly through our defensive fire without being touched, destroy multitudes, and disappear like smoke. What word should I use? The final entry was dated May 15, 1943, 2 days before Nakamura was killed by strafing fire during a low-level raid on Wewak's fuel depot. Lynch saw the culmination of Australian low-level doctrine on June 23, 1943, during Operation Floodtide, the coordinated assault on Japanese positions at Salamaua. The target was Salamaua Airfield, a compact strip carved into coastal flatland with AA defenses that included 17 guns ranging from 20 millimeters to 75 millimeters, plus an estimated 400 infantry positioned in defensive positions with small arms. Intelligence rated the base as heavily defended. Expect high losses for any attack profile. 12 Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron RAAF launched from Dobodura at 0530 hours. Lynch flew as observer in the lead aircraft, piloted by squadron leader Learmonth. The approach was from the northeast over water, altitude 25 feet. Lynch could see individual waves below them. The air was turbulent. Morning thermals were already building. At this altitude, turbulence meant instantaneous altitude changes of 10 to 15 feet. Learmonth corrected constantly, hands moving on the yoke in tiny adjustments that kept them stable. They hit the coast at 0612 hours. Learmonth pulled up to exactly 50 feet, cleared the coastal vegetation, and there was the airfield. Lynch counted 19 parked aircraft, 3 Ki-43 fighters, 12 transport aircraft, 4 reconnaissance planes, all neatly positioned along the strip's southern edge. Learmonth opened fire at 600 meters. The first aircraft exploded, then the second. The third caught fire. The fourth took cannon rounds through the cockpit and fuel tanks, but didn't explode immediately. It just started burning slowly, the fire spreading from nose to tail like a fuse. A fire started. Lynch saw tracers arcing overhead, the gunners still compensating for altitude that didn't exist. One burst came close, rounds passing maybe 15 feet above them. But Learmonth was already turning, breaking left, diving back to 20 feet over the jungle. The entire attack lasted 9 seconds from first shot to egress. The 12 Beaufighters made staggered runs over 14 minutes.